Right, my name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Stephen Hagen at Antiquum Farm, Junction City. It's July 27th, 2020. Stephen, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
First question for you, a little bit different than the first question we usually ask. So let's talk about why farming. Why grapes?
Why farming, why grapes? I got into farming wine grapes really because I just fell in love with agriculture in general. I think that farming has the potential to embody some of the most beautiful and creative things about humanity when it's done in a mindful way. And that also kind of hand in hand with that is that it also has the potential to represent some of the worst instincts of humanity. So, you know, a desire to sort of strive towards predictability, consistency, conformity on the one side of practices, and on the other, I think you can really gravitate towards beauty, expression, articulation, kindness, and empathy. So it was those latter traits that really drew me to farming as a craft, and then I just felt that wine is the product that has the most potential to do a few things. One of them is it has an audience that really needs to hear the messaging that I think our farming style brings. People who can help influence change and change the trajectory of the way that the agricultural industry operates. I forgot what my second thought was going to be on that. But I mean, that was in general. Just I was drawn to it as a craft, and if you're interested in creating a project that is expressive and creative, you know, unfortunately, nobody pokes and sniffs and swirls and prods carrots and broccoli like we do wine. So if you're looking for agriculture to be something that is creative and expressive and beautiful, wine's a really good place to start.
So take us through kind of your life before wine.
So I grew up here in Junction City. So I actually grew up only about 4 miles away from here. So this property was actually a place that I trespassed all over when I was a kid. You know, it was 1970s, early 1980s, very different time. People's ideas of property lines and things like that were a little foggier back then. And also I think I benefited from having a really feral childhood. So it was different out here then, in that property values were a lot lower. So there were kids. There's not a lot of kids out here anymore, which is not a good thing. I feel it's a less complete neighborhood than it was when I was a kid. So we, you know, there were a few dozen of us, and you know, we all had our bikes and horses and motorcycles and all of those sort of, you know, redneck pleasures, and we were all over the place in this neighborhood. I mean, we could be 10 miles in any direction on any given day. You know, we would ride up into the BLM, up in the foothills of the Coastal Range, and have like 5-mile downhill bike races and things like that. So it was a really wild, crazy childhood, and I got to know this place in a way that is very sort of gut level. Mm-hmm. I think that you know, my family was, particularly my father and I, were really into all the outdoor stuff. So fishing, hunting, camping, and my parents were really great from kind of a scary age of just letting me go, So when I was 10 years old, they bought me a very cheap horse and a shotgun, and I could go in the summertime and be gone for 2-3 nights at a time and just out, and they knew that I was okay. And that was really formative, and I feel like there's something about those experiences and that intimacy that I developed with the woods and the hills and the creeks and things around here that really influenced some of the decisions that we started to make when we started farming. So getting into kind of leaving high school, I actually went to a theater conservatory for a couple years out in Chicago. Really interesting experience for me as a 18-year-old kid from a town that at the time had 1,400 people in it when I graduated high school. I couldn't wait to get out of here, and I just knew I knew exactly what I was going to do, and how everything was going to play out. And it turned out when I got to Chicago that I had no idea what living with someone who I didn't even know through the wall right next to me, like what that was. And I had no skill set for living in a city and just dealing with that sort of proximity of human beings. So I ended up getting kicked out of school in my second year, and I moved to Los Angeles with the intention of sort of rebooting and going into USC's conservatory program for theater. And it was there that my parents were also fed up with paying tuition after I'd kind of blown that. So I'd said I was going to work for 2 years and establish residency in California. And in doing that, I started working with a kind of higher end residential design company that was largely focused on events and garden design. And I pretty quickly found out that I had some semblance of natural talent for that, and that I was better at that probably than I was as an actor. And so my dreams of kind of becoming the Norwegian De Niro very quickly moved aside, and I actually realized I could make a living. So within about a year, I formed a garden design company and went to work. And we had close to 10 years of a lot of fun in Los Angeles. So a lot of my friends, it was, this kind of ragtag group of actors and models and musicians and all these people. So great looking gardening crew. I mean, we had the best looking gardening crew in Los Angeles, but we had a lot of fun. We did a lot of really great work, and a really cool time in my life. But then I met my wife, and literally the night we met, and it was like, you want to kind of get out of here and go have babies in Oregon, and we made the decision. So we were engaged formally inside of 2 weeks, and within 2 months we'd actually come up here to visit my folks, saw this property, and decided to make the move. So it was all a little quick. I think if my kids did that, I would freak out, but both of our parents were really cool about it at the time. So it's just one of those things we just knew, so.
Why the desire at that point to come back? Why the desire to come back home?
The first night that Nikki and I hung out, we stayed up all night talking, and we had very, very different upbringing. So my wife is from Salt Lake City, and I'm from here. Her father was a banker. My dad was a high school physics and math teacher, who in the summertime logged and, did things like that. And talking about that childhood that I had, like she was just, she fell in love with that, and she said that she wanted her children to have an upbringing like that. And that led to a discussion of like, well, then we should just have children. And so that was really it. And then, moving up to be closer to my parents. To be perfectly honest, there wasn't this huge, well thought out plan, like a lot of that. And like, you'll see that to this day with the way that we farm and probably the way we run our business. But there's not a lot of planning. There's not a lot of forethought necessarily. I mean, we're trying to get better about that, but it really was just like a gut reaction. And so we drove up here for her to meet my parents, and we booked a caterer for the wedding and bought a farm. Like, there wasn't really a plan. It was just sort of like, we saw this, we wanted to have babies together. We knew we didn't want to be in Los Angeles, and we saw this place, and it was just like, that's the place. That's it. And there was no plan at the time to plant a vineyard. There was no burning desire to make, the new world's best Pinot Noir. There was none of that. It was just like a gut level, the same way that we fell in love. Like, we couldn't help it. Everything that was logical would say, don't do this, and we couldn't help it. So it was just, the property just, a lot like my wife, it just smelled right.
So you have the property, you make the impulse move. What's the next step? What are you thinking at that point?
So at the time, the idea was that I was going to keep the design company running in Los Angeles and work from here. The company had evolved to the point where I could travel we were traveling to do some jobs. It didn't seem like I necessarily had to be there on an everyday basis. And so at the time, we were planning on starting a small nursery in the Pinot Gris vineyard here behind us. And starting a nursery and growing out and supplying what we could grow here to just kind of, fatten margins further in the business. I really quickly learned that we did one job with me up here, and we learned that probably wasn't going to work well. So we started pivoting, and the wine thing was kind of in the back of our mind already, but we really, we didn't know anything about it. I don't pretend that we know anything about it now, but at the time we really knew nothing, and we just kind of jumped into it, to be perfectly honest, because it sounded pretty and romantic. Like, we got into it just out of total ignorance and financial irresponsibility. We got into it for all the wrong reasons. It just happens to be that through that really poor decision, I really found who I was and what I think I was truly meant to do.
Tell me about you mentioned not having really any idea what you were getting into. Why was wine in your mind at all then at that point?
Well, first I got to tell you a little bit about my dad to give you a good answer on that. So my dad is originally from the Upper Peninsula in Michigan. Truly grew up in a family that in many times of the year, his family, they had a fishery on Lake Michigan, and did quite a bit of truly off the land subsistence. So my dad is a feral character. He's 83 years old and he still is out thinning timber. In fact, you can hear him. He's up on our place today thinning timber. So at 83, he's still falling and bucking and yarding trees. So he's an entirely different animal. And he's amazing. Both of my parents are amazing human beings. That said, my dad is also a person who's never had a bad glass of wine. You know, you can pour him one side of the spectrum. How is it, Dad? Oh, it's pretty good. And, you know, other side of the spectrum, pretty good, you know. And it was actually my dad who looked here and looked there and said, you know, I think that'd be a pretty good vineyard. You should think about that. And we listened to him. So, I mean, you know, it's probably not the sort of thing to put out there in the world, but it's true. That is how it happened, you know, and it got us thinking, it got us looking, and then we started asking deeper questions about it and looking into it. By the time that we were serious about planting the vineyard, we had a fairly good idea about, you know, what it was we wanted to do and how we wanted to do it. And a lot of that, and maybe this comes out of, again, like having no formal training in viticulture or business or winemaking, but the questions that I was asking, I didn't feel like I was getting answers that to me felt real. And so that again really shaped the way that we started farming, in that I kind of said, you know what, we're gonna do our own thing, and we're gonna do this our own way. So.
You told us a little bit earlier during the tour about some of that. Tell me about that kind of discovery. You have this idea for vines,
yeah,
and then you go out and try to learn about it, and what happens?
Right. So the thing, just as a total noob to the industry, the idea of terroir. You know, the idea of a place that a place has a soul, and that soul can express itself in wine. It really resonates with me and informs every decision that we make on this property, you know, coupled with having a multi-generational, you know, 100-year geological time view of our property. Those two things coming together are what really influence our decisions. And so when I was trying to, you know, find what's the recipe, I wanted somebody to tell me, like, well, this is what you do, and then you'll have these beautiful articulate wines, and they'll speak. You know, your sites will find their voice. And you know, we developed enough now to know that there's not really a recipe for that. But when I was asking other growers and winemakers, you know, what they do to achieve that in wine, to be totally honest, and I don't make a lot of friends when I say this, I felt like I was talking to politicians. You know, it felt like marketing speak. The answers are very one layer, and they don't actually go anywhere that to me felt like there was any substance to it. And honestly, to this day, like, there's not a lot of growers out there. There's a few. There's a handful and a half of people that I think are pursuing what I think of as sort of meaningful, expression-driven viticulture. but I decided, you know, after looking at organics, after looking at biodynamics, after looking at, you know, certified this and that and everything, I honestly decided, like, I don't know what I'm talking about, but nobody else does too. And there's people out there with PhDs in this stuff that are, I believe, are selling people a bill of goods that doesn't really exist. So what we just, you know, we came at this with the whole idea of doing, of like living a life that was beautiful and meaningful. And I was like, man, I'll be damned if I'm going to do this and have it be fluff. You know, I do, I already sometimes, as someone who just loves like the basic human nature of agriculture, I do struggle sometimes with the idea of that I am making a product that not everybody can afford. You know, it's a luxury thing. It is not, you know, Andrew will tell you the polar opposite, but I will say, like, I don't think it's necessarily an imperative thing. It's not a totally necessary product. It's a luxury. You know, others will say, oh no, it's totally necessary. It's just my personal value system. There's a part of me that would feel much more at ease if I was growing, you know, grain, you know, or broccoli or whatever. So I'll be damned if I'm going to make high-end wines and not have a real serious message behind the farming. So I decided that we were going to farm this place in a way that truly capitalizes on what I see as sort of the inherent nature for individual expression. And I'm not talking about, you know, when people say like, this region does this, or even this vineyard does this. When I look at our vineyards, you know, in viticulture, we tend to look at, like, say, a block of 115 clone Pinot Noir. And we say, oh, well, that does this. That isn't the way I see it at all. Like, this little side hill, this change in elevation, the every little variation in soil depth, almost down to the individual vine level, those are all opportunities for different expression and articulation. And we should be, I believe, we should be farming in a way that drives after that level of expression. And so we started working at how do we farm this place, not in a way that just makes the farm self-contained, but truly makes each vineyard site totally self-contained. So these vineyards have not received any fertilizer since 2007. We don't use foliar feeds. We don't use compost. A lot of what we're driving after, you know, is also as much elimination of machinery as we can. And as I sort of started just, you know, very shade tree level auditing, building compost piles that could actually sustain the vineyard, the amount of machine work for capturing that material, building piles, turning, distributing all of that material, which is a lot, that did not feel sustainable. And we started trying to look at it in ways that were outside of the box, and like, how do we just skip the compost pile? How do we make, you know, instead of feeding hay to cows and collecting that material and building a pile, how do we make the worms our cows? How do we make the microbes in the soil our cows and our sheep, you know? And so for us, the clear thing is, you know, people always think about cover cropping as this thing of you build biomass and then you sort of cut it down, essentially harvest it and then incorporate it. Again, you know, bypassing tillage and saying, look, the real way to capture carbon and store it and, you know, put things where they belong and keep them there, the answer to me was pretty obvious. We got to graze this thing. So then that's where it gets tricky. So then the logistics of how the hell do you do that? And that was Well, it's not over. It's not even close to over. It is something that's continuously evolving. For me, that's the joy of it, is making the system work better and better and better and smoother and smoother. And then you get a new idea and you totally blow it up and the wheels come off, and but you know it's going to get better again. And making our vineyards so much more than vineyards. And in doing so, making them stronger, more resilient, and I think infinitely more articulate. And also what's been interesting is as those shifts have occurred, it's not just that the wines got better, they just got wonderfully weird. You know, there's a lot about these wines that is not appropriate for the southern Willamette Valley or the Willamette Valley, Oregon, and in a lot of instances with our wines, they're not even necessarily varietally correct, but what they are is they are very truthful expressions of this place and who we are and what we believe in.
So you've hinted at it now, but I'm curious. Once you decide that, how do you implement that?
So what does it actually look like?
What does it actually look like?
First, let's put a name on it. I call it grazing-based viticulture. So the idea is using principles of rotational intensive grazing in a vineyard. So cutting the vineyard up into small pieces, it depends, and that's kind of part of the art and the flow of it is depending on the time of the year and what the season's giving us, heat, rainfall, all of these things determine the size of the lots that we're grazing. And then also depending on the time of the year, how many days we're in a given place. But the general goal is to be moving anywhere from every 3 to 10 days. And we're using sheep, pigs, geese, chickens, and now ducks, as we were talking about earlier, thanks to my daughter. All as this sort of migration pattern moving through the vineyard. So the idea is, with every rotation, and we're talking about anywhere from 20 to 25 movements through the site a year, that when plants grow, and this is again one of those things where I think when we're thinking about cover cropping and all these things, I think people are looking at it through the wrong lens. We tend to think of that biomass above the surface of the soil as that's what matters. There is a corresponding biomass of root matter that is underground. Obviously, it's root matter. As it is grazed off, that root mass dies off and recedes. And that die-off creates this stimulation of microbial activity in the soil. So, but then sheep and everybody moves on, and that forage material recovers and those roots repenetrate. And so that's happening again and again and again. There's this sort of breathing in and out in these cycles of like growth and then death and rebirth again and again and again throughout the season. So what's happening as that's occurring is also, because we're not fertilizing, we're not using compost, this place is sitting in isolation. As that microbial population is turning over and over and is being stimulated again and again, it's also changing due to the isolation to become very specific to deal with the circumstances of these vineyard sites. So, and even little different areas within the vineyard. So as that is occurring, what's also happening is those microbial colonies and mycorrhizal fungal colonies are populating the root hairs of the plants, and what begins to happen is they start breaking down the insoluble nutrients in the site. So again, and I keep saying this thing of like, we're looking at this all wrong. in agriculture in general, when we're looking at soil fertility and measuring for it, people are looking at insoluble nutrients. There is, in these soils here, an nearly inexhaustible sea of insoluble nutrients. And so those fungal colonies and bacterial colonies begin breaking down those insolubles and delivering it to the root hairs of the plants. So, and then a cool symbiosis starts happening. The plants start kicking back carbohydrate reserves, so simple sugars going back to the microbes. So they're feeding each other. So the reason that matters is, think back to that you have this microbiological community that is developing in isolation and changing over time, becoming very specific to a place. Mm-hmm. So that's the crux of the whole thing, is like, how do we really drive after place in our wines? That's how. You create a microbiological community that is yours and is feeding the vines, and then the vines change. Mm-hmm. So what's been really extraordinary to see, we didn't really have any expectations going into this. But what came out the other side is nuts. I mean, we've seen a series of true genetic physiological mutations in the vineyard that are really special. We say this is Pinot Gris behind us because that's what it was when we planted. There's a lot about these wines that we don't even really know if that's what it is anymore. We've seen some of these plants out here, the first several years when they were planted, they were Pinot Gris, they were that light purplish, lavender, periwinkle, whatever color you want to call it. And then some of the vines just completely turned color, and now they look like Pinot Blanc or Chardonnay. Some of the vines, you'll have one half of the vine is that color, the other half is Pinot Gris looking. We even get like little individual berries where it looks like you just took a laser and drew a line right down the middle, or like a little pie-shaped wedge where you've got this like green triangle and then Pinot Gris. And if you taste those berries, and you taste a lot of the fruit out in this site, it's nothing like the varietal. The skins taste nothing like it in portions of the vineyard. So we treat the wines very differently. Mm-hmm. So from a winemaking perspective, we aren't coming at this from, like a winery back out to the field perspective, or even, God forbid, like market to, there's some wines we make 75 cases of that we could probably sell 1,500 cases of it, but the source material isn't there. Mm-hmm. So the wines that we make are solely based upon seeing something really special in a certain spot in the vineyard, and then trying to find the best way to honor that in the cellar with as little intervention as possible, if any at all. So yeah, it's logistically, the system is a nightmare, and it's full of joy and beauty at the same time. It's one of those things that it is infinitely challenging and frustrating. I think there's a reason, a very sound, good reason that like nobody else is doing this so far. It is absolutely like financially infeasible. I just don't pay myself anything, is what it really comes down to. But I have work that is really, it comes down to that thing of like happiness versus fulfillment, and are they the same thing? I know that like, I know I'm wearing my joints out at a very early age. I'm often frustrated at, the shortcomings and the limits of my own abilities. But I feel really fulfilled mm-hmm. by the work. It gets me up every single morning. Some reasons because I'm mad, but a lot of days because I'm excited. Mm-hmm. I'm excited about making it better, and always striving towards making it run a little smoother and become a more and more expressive place.
So once you decide this is, or start to make this decision, you kind of have this vision forward, and you're trying to minimize machinery, you're trying to maximize the individual space. Tell me about finding the animals, mm-hmm. the proper animals, training the animals,
right,
and then getting them to become part of the system.
Right. So breed selection is really important. A huge part of the process is what animals fit the system. Do cows work? Do horses work? All of these things. At the time when I was developing these ideas, a huge part of my personal identity was I worked with draft horses. I farmed with them. I still have a team of draft horses, and they were for many, many years a huge part of our vineyard. If you go to our very outdated website, which is currently being updated, there are pictures of a younger, skinnier, less hairy me with a team of draft horses working in the vineyard. As this system evolved, that became obsolete because simply the work that we were doing with the horses was a lot of tillage, prepping for cover crops, all those kinds of things. So that was one of the first things as the system transitioned. That went away. And we were looking for, what are the right animals to fit into the vineyard. One of the first pitfalls was, and I still hear people say this all the time, get baby doll Southdown sheep because they're so short they can't reach the vines. It's bullshit. It's unless you have your heads trained up at 60 inches, what I saw in very short order is that those sheep will put their feet up on, they can even just stand up on their back legs and just munch away and destroy your vineyard in short order. So we kind of have geared towards a couple different breeds of sheep, but we've also selected kind of for our own strain as we go. So we're trying to breed down height, but still have nice lammy, meaty carcasses on them, because we're not interested in them just being ornaments out there. We want to make this a complete farm. So those other products are part of the mix. They're part of our hospitality program. But the sheep that we're crossing are Katahdins and Dorpers, and then selecting individuals that are also shorter. So the shorter is not with the idea that they can't reach the vines. The shorter is the idea that they fit underneath the cane wires in a vineyard that was planted with, not considering sheep in the beginning. So we're basically trying to fit them under and we did raise our heads after a few years. So now we're trying to fit them under a 29-inch wire. So that's just to get their backs to clear. And then we used to use a process called aversion training, which was something that I never really felt fully comfortable with, but I also was not ready to financially implement the system that we have now. But aversion training is where you work with creating digestive disruption in the sheep after having them eat grapevines, and they get a stomach ache for about an hour. Similar to a mild to medium tier hangover, and then they tend to avoid eating the vines. What we started experiencing was that that training will work as long as you have palatable forage in the vineyard. So if the idea is to really sustain the vineyard and have livestock out there year round, that can, as vintages are getting warmer and drier, some of those windows were getting too short to have to have the program actually be meaningful. So I think it was 2017, because we retrofitted last year. So 2017, it was so dry that we actually had to pull the sheep out in the middle of May. And I just said, we're going to shift. And luckily we were also nearly in a place financially where we could transition to the system that we have now, which is now we have offset electrical wires in the trellis. So one pair that is down just below head height, and then the whole system is sort of adjustable and movable. So we can, as shoots grow and things like that, we can move things out if we need to, or change the proportion on either side. But they're in as close to the head as we can get without shorting out the system. And then we've got another that are just up above the cane wire that stand out at about 10 or 11 inches on either side. Again, I mean, those wires make moving catch wires, leaf pulling, picking fruit, it makes all of these things more difficult, more expensive. It makes your vineyard crews hate you and wonder, why Steve's got to be so nuts. But it works extremely well. So, and then outside of that, we've got, our Kuni pigs that you met earlier, small statured pig, a true grazing pig. So we've been able to sustain those pigs entirely on forage from May 15th until just a couple weeks ago. So the beginning of July, and their smaller stature and size will keep them from breaking off vines, disturbing soil. They have kind of little short upturned snouts, so as they try to root, they just kind of skim along the surface, and so they get frustrated. So as long as you give them a good wallow to cool down in on a warm day, they tend to not disrupt the soil, which is part of our goal. So, and then coming behind all of that, coming behind the sheep and the pigs are, like in any natural migration pattern, is our flock of birds. So kind of the core of that are the chickens, so we've got geese in there that are kind of doing the final pass of grazing. So they'll take things down to, a couple inches, 2 to 3 inches. And then the chickens are there to kind of act as a weeding and sanitation crew. So any green growing weeds that we have left in the undervine area, we're throwing scratch grain at those weeds. And so the chickens will go after that scratch grain. And as they scratch after it, they'll scratch away the weeds. So you'll see out in our vineyard, there's dirt sometimes just thrown all over the place. So, and that's one of the things about this system. I really hope that consumers can slowly move away from the idea that if they look at a vineyard and it looks like a golf course, that it's well farmed. If the idea is to have something that is complete and expressive, it's not going to be neat and tidy, and it shouldn't be. There should be a pig wallow in it, and there should be, shit everywhere, and I mean, that is what a natural system looks like. So the chickens are scratching through all of that manure, so breaking it apart. What they're doing is going after pests and parasite eggs and things like that. So when I say they're the sanitation crew, what they're really doing is they're cleaning it up for the next pass. So they're keeping our sheep parasite free. Everything is getting kind of cleaned up, exposed to air, exposed to sunlight, and so that in the next pass we can have sheep that are healthy and happy. So we haven't used any wormers on our sheep for 7 years, something like that, I think, which is a serious victory. And now we're at the point where we're at sort of genetic resistance level through selection. So if we see 1 or 2 that have picked up parasites, they get kicked out of the program, and that's just selection, for low maintenance over time.
So the way you've described this sounds like a lot of trial and error and a lot of developing, like you mentioned, kind of developing on the run. So tell me about what you've done that has kind of created more. You do one thing, you like it, but it's not quite right. Tell me about the kind of process of finding the right fit and of some of the things like you mentioned, some things you've tried that haven't really worked. Some of the kind of missteps along the way that have kind of brought you to where you are now.
Yeah, I mean the Baby Doll Southdown sheep was definitely one of them. Aversion training was something that, the first couple years when we did it, I thought, man, this is it. This is the answer. It's easy. I mean, it's not easy, but it's easier than what we do now. But then, circumstances changed. And I mean, to me, that's what good farming is observation, not getting locked in. It's one of the things I hate about certification is you get, if you set this bar and you have this checklist and then that's sort of the end of the discussion, it's sort of a death knell to creativity. So that's what I really love about this system is every season is different. And they all, everyone has its set of challenges, and even down to like thinking of the vines as individuals. The animals are also individuals, so they all have their different quirks and personalities, and that's part of the joy of the intimacy of this thing. So yeah, it's just one of those things that every year there's something you did last year that absolutely is not going to work, and you just have to keep the conversation going, stay self-critical, which isn't always fun, but just constantly keep working at it and tinkering with it. And that is, for me, that's the meaning of it, and that's the joy in it. Is just that it's constant discovery. It's what keeps me interested and engaged.
You mentioned consumers a couple of times, and I'm curious because what you're doing is so different, and it's creating such a different product than anybody else has. When it comes to, we'll start with producers who you work with. Tell me about selling someone Pinot Gris that may or may not still be Pinot Gris, for example. How do you find winemakers outside of here who want to work with you, and what is the relationship like in terms of what are you promising them? What do they want from you versus what they want from a more typical grower? Yeah,
I mean, in general, the people that buy fruit from us are coming to us because they understand and appreciate that different voice. And not everyone is looking for that, and I totally understand and respect that. Everybody has a different program, and we're making wines for different reasons, for different markets and different customer bases. And when this vineyard really did start shifting, and that's kind of an interesting thing that happened, is once we had this program really running, so we started in 2007, it was really running by 2010. And that was a year where everything in the vineyard like completely shifted in 1 year. It was just an absolute about face. And there were a couple vineyard clients that weren't down with Pinot Noir that had a pH that was more reflective of sparkling wine. Like our pH is one of the things that happens with our Pinot Noirs is we have pHs that like belong at 17 or 18 bricks. And then it tends to be a vineyard that expresses itself at a level that honestly is usually kind of considered overripe, but those two things sit together. So you've got this very, very low pH with an extremely advanced ripening. And there were a couple clients that we had that just didn't, they hadn't seen that in the winemaking or history textbooks, and they didn't want any part of it. There were other people that saw it and started salivating, because it was what one, winemaker in particular said to me was, this is what we all say we want, just people don't know it when they see it, because it hasn't happened. So that and I really don't, I try to not have judgment on that. I definitely have a certain way that I gravitate, and I don't gravitate towards predictability, and I think that this thing, again, like I said earlier, the more that we move away from conformity, uniformity, predictability, the more we move towards something that's meaningful.
So more question with consumers then. You're creating a product then that is different than anything else they may taste. I know, for example, the Pinot Noir I tasted from you was unlike anything I'd ever had, and so I'm curious about attracting consumers, especially at a premium price, to a product that is so unique and so different from year to year, from block to block, as yours is. So tell me about what consumers are finding, how they're finding you, and sort of what's keeping them coming back.
Yeah, one of the things that's really interesting is the wines are different. They are, as I often say, they're wonderfully weird. But they're also classically well made. They aren't weird for the sake of being, they aren't different for the sake of being different. They're different because it's just honestly what they are. And so for me, it's kind of one of those like real recognizes real things that, I think when people see it and experience it, they recognize it, and I think we also have the benefit of that the wines are also on like entry level on the wine. They're enjoyable, they're not wines where you have to sit there and go, do I like it? Do it? They're yummy, so that helps. It can be a challenge sometimes in the sort of like on-premise, restaurant market, when you're trying to fit a wine onto a wine list. Now that tends to be an entry into a market, conundrum, that then as you become established, then hopefully with time people get to know the wines, and then you aren't this thing sitting there that someone just blindly picks off of the list because it hits the right price point, and then they're like, this isn't Willamette Valley Pinot Noir. But I will say that every now and then there's a buyer that just says, this is not Willamette Valley Pinot Noir to me. It's not for me. I get that. I totally understand that. Some of those buyers have become some of our most ardent supporters, because it led to a deeper conversation of like, well, let's talk about that set of expectations, and should that even be the conversation that we're having? Is that really what you want, is to know what you're getting? Isn't your job more fun to go to that customer that's coming into your restaurant and saying, I have something you need to see? I think it's more fun. And oftentimes when we're out in market, we have some success with converting people to that viewpoint. And then, with direct to consumer customers, we just hope to win them over with pigs. Seriously though, what we really enjoy most of all is pouring the wines in context, getting people here, showing them the work on the farm, and then pouring them the wines and saying, and being able to show people This is why these wines are the way they are.
Sure.
And some of our, in outside markets and other places, some of our most ardent supporters, retailers that support Antiquum Farm in a really meaningful way, are the result of them having come here, stayed in the cottage, and visited the farm, and then and maybe before that they sold a couple cases a year, and then they came here and they went, oh, okay, now I get it, and then they go out and become evangelists for grazing-based. To me, like if I can get a retailer not talking about wine, but talking about how sheep and pigs and chickens can influence wine, and how what really floats my boat is if I can get a somm in a restaurant talking about that. When we think about the idea of terroir, like everybody talks about it as like, well, it's climate and it's soil. Well, there's a lot more. There's the people, there's the culture of the people that live in the place, and there's that microbiological culture as well. And I'm always saying, like, biology is place. And I believe that more. I think that it has a greater and a potentially greater influence than soil. Is just what makes a place a place? Is it like having all of these different inputs in like this perfect ratio on paper that then is applied at a given rate to a site, or is it the things in the place that are alive? You hear my answer to that in my tone. Like I just really strongly believe in that.
So you really want us talking about like the importance of pig shit to the wine that you have. Okay.
Yeah, and like root die off, and and that the importance of microbiology in place, and like its ability to influence how that wine is expressing itself. Like ideally, it's not always going to happen. Sometimes they'll just say this is really different and delicious, and that's plenty. I mean, we'll take what we can get. So
as you start a program like that, and it comes time to actually make wine, tell me about that process of finding people to work with to kind of fulfill the vision of what Antiquum wines would taste like.
Yeah, I am really lucky. So Andrew Bandy Smith is our winemaker, and I've known dude for a while, and honestly, before he was even a winemaker, I just decided that he was the guy eventually, that he was the right person for the job. Winemakers talk a lot about respecting fruit and farming and vineyards, but again, like there's this human tendency, we got to put our thumbprints on things, and ego gets in the way. And I'm not saying Andrew doesn't have an ego. He's the human being like the rest of us, but he has about as small a one as anyone I've ever met, and he doesn't care about being known, but I think he should be known. He doesn't care about being known. He's more interested truly in the multi-generational approach of this property. So he's interested in passing this on to my children if they desire to step into this, against all advice and and good thinking. And he has an intuition about this vineyard and an understanding of it and a respect for the farming that I have not seen anywhere else. So even before he was a winemaker, when he was kind of cellar assistant, I was just like, I'm going to keep my eye on that guy. And honestly, like, you know, he's made some wines, and he made some very good wines, you know, at a pretty prestigious program. But like, there weren't a lot of years here. But there's a wisdom and a depth of understanding to the way that he approaches our work that is awesome to get to be a part of. So the wines have shifted a lot, and I've been proud of every wine we've made, but I feel like the last few years the wines have just dropped into a greater sense of truth and honesty, and a willingness to just let things be what they are. You know, to not, like, it's something we're continuously saying here is like, style is not a thing. You know, in wine we talk about style in the industry, like we talk about style all the time, and we don't think that should even be part of the conversation. It's, to us, it's just what happens, you know.
You mentioned the multi-generational kind of long-term approach here. Obviously, your family has grown up with this as part of it. So tell me about the kind of having family entwined with the business, and sort of what your long-term vision would be for this space.
Yeah, you know, I mean, first and foremost, I never want to impose my vision on my kids. That said, there's dreams, you know, and I mean, obviously my dream would be for my family to always be working together forever, but I fully respect that my kids may have other talents or desires. They may want to live somewhere else. I know I did, you know, when I was, like I said earlier, I couldn't wait to get out of here, you know, and then I couldn't come back fast enough, you know. So you never know what's going to happen, but it's been great, you know, the kids growing up. You know, the whole birds coming in the vineyard and being part of the system, that was something that was largely introduced by my daughter, you know, and some of it through kind of happy accident, but through having, you know, a 5-year-old 10 chickens, and they get out and they get in the vineyard, and you know, and then you see something happening, and like I was saying, you know, good farming is observation and reaction, and so, but both kids have grown up working in this, you know, sometimes more than others, sometimes a lot, you know. As my daughter has gotten older, she has, until in the last year. So this year she's actually sort of redoubled and intensified her love of all things with wings, and that's been really great. She's going on to college next year, and it's been really cool to see her reconnecting with the farm. But sort of through her like late middle school and high school years, she developed her own set of really intense interests. She's very politically engaged, activism, and is also a very ferocious high school debater that, you know, did some really great those in a very, very small program. So she was very, very competitive on kind of national level. So those were really her passions, were sort of debate and political policy stuff and activism. And that's exactly who she is and what she should be doing. And I'm really excited for her to move on this fall and be where she should be, you know. And my son is 14, going on 25, and he's also sort of doing that teenage like slight pulling away. He's had a much more intense engagement with the farm sort of through his middle school years, and at times has really been my right-hand person here, especially during the summer months. But he largely maintains this garden around us, so he's kind of become our groundskeeper, because he will willingly do that work. And then, he does all kinds of other things. He does he's kind of interested in metalworking. He makes knives and forges iron and all this kind of stuff. So he's also learned to weld. So, if I have kind of metal repair stuff with equipment, he does that. And then he works with the animals in the vineyard quite a bit. So he does, I'm going to say now, somewhere around, anywhere from 18 to 20 hours a week. He's on payroll, likes money, building up that date budget for high school, I think, is part of the idea. But he's also very interested in the hospitality side of things. So one of the things that we do with our wine club that we call the Antiquum Farm family is we have a guest chef that comes in and works with us for a year to take the club through seasonal dinners every year. And so last year we were working with Carl Hall, and it was really cool to watch through the year Jules' level of interest in that grow, and Carl kind of letting him do more and more with each step, with each season. So I don't know. He talks about winemaking. He talks about food as potentially part of the equation. He also, a few years ago he was going to be a professional skateboarder. So, he's 14. We'll see where he lands.
Maybe all of the above.
Yeah, I mean, I know it'll be interesting. He's an interesting cat who is just, he's one of those people that he says, I want to try everything. And that can, for a parent, that can be a little scary sometimes. But he's an exciting person to be around, and it's never dull. So
obviously we're talking to you in July of 2020 in the midst of a pandemic still. I'm curious how COVID-19 has affected your practices here, your business, your farming, and kind of how you see it playing out into harvest.
Yeah. Boy, that's a tough one. I'll be honest. It's been really hard for everybody. From a business standpoint, it's been pretty devastating. I'm confident that we are getting through to the other side, as long as that side comes in a reasonable time frame. It's been there were some holes in our plan and the way that our business was structured that we were already well aware of, and we're in process of plugging those holes, and then all of this happened, and then it was like a flashing sign with a siren blaring that, like, yeah, the internet matters, and all these things, like, technology is not something I do, and it became evident that, that was a fault. We were largely distributed and did not have a very large, we were working on rolling out our direct-to-consumer program. So we happen to be in a part of the Willamette Valley where a lot of the brands are purely direct-to-consumer, and not a lot of distribution, out-of-state market sales. So we very sort of initially conscientiously said we're gonna do the exact opposite. We're gonna focus elsewhere, and then sort of let our broader market drive our direct-to-consumer sales. Well, that worked, and then now it doesn't work. So and it's we're well positioned to get through it, but it's been a challenge. And we're working with finding the right messaging to let people know that this is still a safe place and pleasurable place to come you visit. One of the nice things is we were always a reservation appointment only model for direct to consumer. So outside of masks and hand sanitizer, outside of COVID protocols, we didn't really shift anything. If anything, we actually created more opportunities for people to be able to come because we were also just looking at rolling out a more robust direct-to-consumer program. Coming into harvest, it's going to be a challenge. That's all stuff that we're combing through right now. How do we pick fruit? Luckily processing wines, it's Andrew and I and my son. So we're all part of each other's bubble, and we have been for months. So we're not particularly worried there on the processing end, but things like bottling protocol and picking are definitely going to present some challenges. One thing that we are that I'm grateful for is that we've been night picking for years. So instead of working with anywhere from 15 to 25 pickers in a night, we rarely work with more than 5 to 7. And a lot of nights it's just Pedro and I that pick. If we've got 3 tons, it's us, because you have such a wider window to pull that fruit off. And we still have fruit hitting the crush pad at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. We're done processing wines by 9, 10 o'clock all the time, and we're back here setting up for the next day. So we're able to run with a much smaller, tighter crew who is already, one of the things we did this year, we were largely, our vineyard crew is myself, my son, Pedro, his wife Leticia, and then we occasionally bring in maybe 3 more people for like a leaf pulling, shoot positioning, things like that. This year, one of the things we did is we just committed to those additional people and said, we're going to keep you busy and you're our crew through the season. So there's been a lot of sort of fluff busy work for those people, but it also became a matter of like, we're just going to retain you so that we don't have people coming and going. So we can establish that bubble and have a little more, people when they leave work, they go do what they do and you don't have control over that. But at least we're talking to the same people and staying consistent with our messaging, and that feels like the best we can do in many ways.
So what are the biggest changes you've seen in Oregon wine since you've been a part of it? What are the biggest differences between then and now?
Oh geez, when we came into this, I thought, well, this is the peak of the growth. It can't get any bigger. So that's one thing. Something that seems to be shifting over time that I think is really great is I see sort of Oregon increasingly raising the bar on hospitality and understanding that this is an experience-driven industry. So people really like digging into making really in-depth, meaningful experiences for their consumers. So I think that's great. On the one hand, I dispel organics and biodynamics, but I also want to be really clear, like, that's my team. We're all on the same team there, because there's other things that are for producing a luxury product that I think are just downright criminal. That if I was in charge, you couldn't do some of those things. So that sort of increasing sustainability practices in the Oregon wine industry. I mean, I think that Oregon is a real leader in terms of sustainability, not just in wine and agriculture in general. I think it's a place that people look to. I think it's what they think of now. It's part of the Oregon brand. And that's something that I'm really proud to be a part of. Yeah, so I mean, those would be some of the shifts that I've seen, as those things just sort of increasing and digging in. And a lot of younger people stepping in and starting brands. People working with different varietals, and I mean, that isn't, when we planted, it was Pinot and Gris, and everyone was tearing out Chardonnay to plant Pinot Gris, and now they're tearing out Pinot Gris. I happen to, and it may be just because of what's occurred here, but I believe in the varietal. And I think it's coming back, baby. It's going to be the new edgy wine. No, I mean, I think that, those that if you farm for it, and if you make those wines with ambition and intention, then they come. And if you don't, then they're what people expect of Pinot Gris. So yeah, those would be some of the shifts I'm looking at.
What about as you look ahead? What is the next decade going to look like for Oregon wine?
Oh, geez, you're probably asking the wrong dude. And I tend to generally just kind of keep my finger on my own pulse and not tune in too much. I don't know. I'm not sure I can really give an informed answer on that. Andrew will give you a really great answer on that.
Is there something you hope
he
for?
talks to everybody, and I stay here and hide on the farm.
Is there something you hope for as you look ahead?
Yeah, I mean, I want grazing-based viticulture to take over the industry, which means everybody goes broke. No, I mean, yeah. Again, that sort of leadership in sustainability, I would like to see our industry become more diverse. I mean, I know, like, that's something that everyone is talking about right now. I'm glad that the spotlight is on it. It's something that we've been talking about for years, since we got into it. Oregon is an overwhelmingly white place. And as someone who, from a farming perspective, believes in diversity, and that diversity makes things stronger, more resilient, more interesting, and more beautiful, like, that doesn't stop at sheep for me. Like, I always say that you can see my politics in my farming. When I talk about individual voices, vines being individuals and not subjecting them to a homogenized input. Like, I mean that from a very, like, human perspective. So what I really hope and want to see is that we're not just posting memes, and making statements. That we're doing things that are actionable and taking steps, and there are people out there that are doing that, but we need to be putting real money into it, resources and time, and I mean, I don't know, it needs to. It's something that has to change, and it has to change rapidly. So,
what about the future for you here and for Antiquum? What do you see over the next decade here?
What do I see for me here? I I don't know, man. I mean,
Hang on one second. I'm gonna pause
Yeah.
you for 1 second.
We should switch batteries.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll ask you the question. It's the last question, so
Okay.
we'll have one more question for you too. We'll save that one for last. So, future for yourself. What do you see as you look ahead for yourself and for Antiquum?
You know, from here at the farm, we're definitely trying to continue to up our hospitality game, make things, have better and better experiences for our people, and that's for someone with an unrefined feral redneck background, that's challenging. I'm lucky to have Andrew and other people around me who have good taste to help us along. And for Antiquum, we do want to continue to expand into other markets, but also, most importantly, never settle. It is frustrating, and coming back to again that thing of happiness versus fulfillment, and do those things, can they really necessarily sit together? I mean, I don't think that there's an easy answer to that. So I just want to keep the conversation going. I want to keep the conversation going about sustainability, true sustainability, not something that's just about checking off things on a list. I would hope that with time, our work that we do here becomes a recognized part of that conversation. And I get, like, it's wingnut stuff for most people, and it's financially irresponsible, and it doesn't, it's not a method, it's a lifestyle. It's an all-in thing. But I would love to move to a point where we are helping people who are interested in this way of working, so that we aren't just this weird little winery down in Junction City that does this thing. Like, I would like to share this and help it grow. And I think that it would be a valuable contribution to viticulture in general, if there were more people looking at wine and farming in general, and in this way.
Question I skipped over earlier. Why the name Antiquum?
Latin for old methods, old stuff, aging guy. So originally the vineyard was called Old School. And that came out of, I was saying earlier, the farming with draft horses, and that, the wonderful thing about farming with draft horses is it actually, that one thing opened my life up to a whole beautiful subculture of people who farm in some really beautiful ways. And through those people, I found what I consider to kind of be my farming gods, and people that people like Wendell and even, like people that are still around, like originally, started out farming here in Junction City, was a guy named Lynn Miller that's sort of a draft horse guru, and I think of the guy as kind of a prophet in ways. But Joel Salatin, all these different people I found through that community. I'm not much of a reader, but back then it was, people going like, have you read this guy? Have you read this guy? And all of this stuff, like some of it you read and you go like, well, that's bullshit. And you throw it out, But even in the bullshit, there's always there's a little something you take away from it. And over time you form your own, your own complete sense of your complete view. And yeah, so Antiquum again also is kind of, when I was farming with horses, it was, you're working largely with equipment from, Max 1920, and everything else. So just everything you're doing when you're working that way, you're surrounded by antiquity, you know, and so it's just that, you know, old methods.
Right. That's all the questions that I have for you. Is there anything I didn't ask that I should have? Anything we didn't cover today that we should have covered?
No, I think we did it.
All right. Excellent.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Thank you so much for your answers, for your stories, for your philosophies, and we'll go ahead and let you off the hook.
Thank you so much.